Hello, students. Welcome to our meeting today. I'm your teacher, Sir Jimmy Guban, for your subject Disaster Readiness and Risk Reduction. And for today's topic, we will discuss Module 1, so please listen carefully. Disasters have always been a result of human interaction with nature, technology, and other living entities, sometimes unpredictable and sudden, sometimes slow and lingering. Various types of disasters continually affect the way in which we live in our daily lives. Human beings, as innovative creatures, have sought new ways in which to curb the devastating effects of disaster. So, this explains that in terms of nature, natural disasters are naturally occurring events that causes damage to human life, but human activity can also increase their frequency and intensity. For example, deforestation and wiping out trees. These human activities may increase risk for flooding, soil erosion, and drought. In terms of technology, the technology has been employed to track disasters relief efforts by using drones and robots to locate survivors, team, and transmit information to emergency rescue. For example, between 1990 and 2017, an average of 17 firefighters died per year during activities related to fighting wildfires. In 2017, firefighters deployed drones for the first time to help combat the creek and Skirball fires, tearing through Los Angeles County. The drones were mainly used to assess property damage caused by the fires. Equipped with thermal sensors, the drones enabled operators to identify active hotspots so firefighters could be dispatched to extinguish the fire in that area. This marked the start of a robust drone program that would actively assess with firefighting, search and rescue operation, and delivering supplies. However, for years, human conduct regarding disasters has been reactive in nature. Communities, sometimes aware of the risks that they face, would wait in anticipation of disastrous event and then activated plans and procedures. Human social and economic development has further contributed to creating vulnerability and thus weakening the ability of humans to cope with disasters and their effects. So this explains that awareness and preparedness in times of disaster is very important. It can reduce the rate of damage in property, deaths, missings, and economic loss. Advanced planning procedure for the anticipation of disastrous event may also reduce the risk and destruction of disaster. Disasters impede human development. Gains in development are inextricably linked to the level of exposure to disaster within any given community. In the same light, the level of disaster risk prevalent in a community is linked to the developmental choices exerted by that community. The link between disasters and development is well researched and documented. Disasters have a devastating impact on development. Families lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. Communities lost businesses, jobs, and services. Children, and particularly girls, miss school and are at risk of early marriage. The list of impacts goes on. Disasters can cancel progress on poverty reduction. The fact that disasters impact on development. For example, a school being washed away in a flood, and development increase or decrease the risk of disaster. For example, introducing earthquake-resistant building techniques is widely accepted. So I will show to you some earthquake-resistant building techniques in our discussion for today. Yet every year in Africa suffers disaster losses which set back development and leave our communities living in perpetual state of risk. So as you can see in our image, That is the representation of a school being washed away in a flood. In your Google Classroom, I will send an activity related about a school being washed away in a flood. But for now, we will discuss the earthquake-resistant building techniques and why Africa suffers disaster losses. So in this image, as you can see here, the right image is the natural disaster risk in Africa. They are mainly epidemics, endemic diseases, drought, floods, agricultural pests, and bushfires. But some areas are also susceptible to earthquakes, cyclones, and volcanic eruption. The image at the left side is the Great Rift Valley. It is a series of contiguous geographic trenches, approximately 6,000 kilometers in total length. The Great Rift Valley is being created as the Arabian, Nubian, and Somalian tectonic plates move apart, stretching and thinning the Earth's crust, as volcanic tremors and the forces that are pulling the plates apart combine to break and thin the crust into earthquake-generating fault lines. So we will discuss now the techniques for earthquake-resistant design of structures. It's very essential, this kind of topic, because it is being related in your STEM track. We have at least 5 techniques for earthquake-resistant design of structures. The first one is the floating foundation. Floating foundation is the levitating or floating foundation separates the substructure of the building from its superstructure. We have also the Kaisen Foundation, commonly known as pile foundation. It is a watertight retaining structure. Next, we have shock absorption design. It absorbs tremors of earthquake. Next, we have rocking core wall. It reduces rocking movements. And lastly, we have cross bracing, to increase of building capability to withstand the seismic activity. Okay, so we will define first the floating foundation. A floating foundation for a building is defined as a foundation in which the weight of the building is approximately equal to the full weight, including water, of the soil removed from the site of the building. Okay, so in this figure, it represents a small scale frame building. As you can see here, the scale frame is illustrated by these red members. Steel frame is basically used in construction, and what you see here is a typical way of how buildings were constructed. The building is reinforced by a foundation made of steel frames and concrete tied beams, and the steel members stretch all the way down to this foundation, which is known as the floating foundation. The purpose of this foundation is to spread the weight of the building evenly. So what is the purpose? Why the weight must be even? Because in order to be balanced. So pag walang nakasupport na foundation sa steel members na ito, they will just sink right into the ground. Magkakaroon siya class ng mabilis na pagguho sa isang gusali. Next, a foundation must support the building above it all. The loads that are exerted on it, so the building must have an equal distribution of load in order for the building to be stable and can withstand the force of earthquake. So the figure represents the unbalanced distribution of foundation, which results to tilting of building and eventually it will collapse. So this representation is very important that you should avoid if you are an engineer or an architect. Therefore, we must design a foundation of a building that constructed equally and evenly to remain in balanced position. We have also the Kaisen Foundation. Definition of Kaisen Foundation. It is a prefabricated hollow box or cylindrical sunk. So it is being attached to the basement of the building, as you can see in our figure. It is cylinder, meaning that this piles or kaisen is circular in nature or circular in shape because it is cylindrical, and it is also hollow. It's sunk into the ground to some desired depth and then filled with concrete, thus forming a foundation. So binubuhusan natin ng konkreto yung foundation na ito para mas maging matibay. So Kaisen Foundation is most often used in the construction of bridge, yung mga tulay, pier, and other structures that require foundation beneath rivers and other bodies of water. So mas maiging i-construct natin yung building sa Kaisen Foundation pag nakatayo siya sa dagat or sa ilog. So what is the reason behind Kaisen Foundation? Okay, so para mas maintindihan natin, we will represent an image on how Kaisen Foundation is being constructed. So let us take a look at the first image. The Kaisen Foundation is designed to set up a hollow pile, as you can see here, commonly made of galvanized iron material. So when we say galvanized iron, it is a very heavy metal. But before that, assigned drilling is required in structural planning with the reinforcement of vibro hammer, designed to full set up the hollow pile to be driven by a hammer into the ground and down to the bedrock, and that forms the casing. So in this case, the vibro hammer is an instrument designed to fully set up the kaisen or the pile to be driven in the ground. Next, the hollow pile material serves as casing for the vibro hammer in order to continue drilling all the way to the bottom until it reaches the bedrock. So what is the purpose why it must reach the bedrock? A vibro hammer is a device that reduces the resistance of the ground with vibration, and by changing the formation of the ground, this in turn transfers vibration to the ground, which reduces the friction between the pile and the ground, allowing the pile to be driven or extracted. Next, a steel cage is loaded and is lowered all the way to the bottom. As you can see here in the image, this steel cage is circular, composed of reinforcement steel bars or reinforced steel bars welded together, and then drops all the way to the bottom. Then a mixed concrete cement is now settled using the concrete mixer. The mixed concrete cement is settled all the way down to the casing until it becomes solid. Then the vibro hammer that is used to pull out the casing, so what you left with is the solidified concrete with reinforcing steel in it. It all hidden in the ground and directly attached to the bedrock, and now this provides a very firm footing foundation for a very tall building that can withstand the force of a strong earthquake. So the objective of this Kaisen Foundation is to build or attach the pile in the bedrock. The bedrock is a very solid state of soil which is very strong in earthquake force. So here are some of the other earthquake resistant building design that could help resist earthquake forces. At the top we have cross bracing, which is designed to support both sides of the front wall of the building. At the right side corner, we have also the rocking core walls, commonly known as shear walls, that reduces earthquake movements. Typically, it is constructed as a large size column, serve as the main support of all tied beam, which are constructed equally. And at the bottom, we have shock absorption design that absorbs directly the sudden movement of the ground caused by earthquakes. So in Japan, there is a lot of shock absorption design in order to support their buildings, skyscrapers, etc. So our course description. This course focuses on the application of scientific knowledge and the solution of practical problems in a physical environment. It is designed to bridge the gap between theoretical science and daily living. At the end of our module, you should be able to explain the meaning of disaster, differentiate the risk factors underlying disaster, describe the effects of disasters on one's life, explain how and when an event becomes a disaster, and analyze disaster from the different perspectives: physical, psychological, socio-cultural, economic, political, and biological. The Philippines is an archipelago state consisting of 7,100 islands and islets, and covering a land area approximately 300,000 square kilometers. The country comprises three groups of large islands: Luzon Group, North and West, consisting of Luzon, Mindoro, and Palawan; the Visayas Group in the center, consisting of Bohol, Cebu, Leyte, Masbate, Negros, Panay, and Samar; Mindanao in the south, Manila, and nearby Quezon City. The country's most populous cities are the part of National Capital Region, known as NCR or Metro Manila, located on the largest island, Luzon. So the Philippines is called an archipelago because it consists of a large number of islands, but it doesn't mean it is far from natural disaster. Based on the recent studies, the Philippines has suffered from an inexhaustible number of deadly typhoons, earthquakes, volcano eruptions, and other natural disasters. This is due to its location along the Ring of Fire, where many of Earth's volcanic eruptions and earthquakes occur faster. Next, the island and groups are divided into four main classes of administrative division, which consists of 17 autonomous regions, 81 provinces, 1,489 municipalities, and the smallest political units, 42,044 barangays as of 2018. The Philippines is governed by a presidential form in which power is divided among the three juridical branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, which seek democracy and balance by carrying their equally weighted duties to uphold law, rights, and representation of the interests of the people. In our figure, that is the representation of territories prone risk in the Philippines. In our legend, the yellow color is the inland basins, and the pale yellow is the coastal plains, and the red represents the coastal mountains. So, in this slide, it explains on how this presidential type of government respond to natural disaster. The answer is aiming to ensure the timely, effective, and coordinated response by the national government and its resources. The national government's strategic action for providing response assistance to manage earthquake and tsunami related incidents. Furthermore, it identifies bridging and coordinating mechanism, activities, common tools, and resources for its implementation. The government embraces all conceivable contingencies, making use of available resources from the government, non-government organizations, private sectors, volunteer groups, and other response operation actors. It also heavily relies on the capacities and capabilities of the different levels of the local government. The term hazard, disaster, and disaster risk are often used interchangeably, but there are primary differences among them. A hazard is a threat or harm that has potential to cause damage. Example: you have an injury, destruction of properties, environmental degradation. There are two main types of hazards: the natural and man-made hazards. These two differ greatly in terms of their causes, scope, and effects on life, property, and the environment. Note the concept and nature of hazards will be discussed further in Module 3 of this unit. So this explains that a hazard is an agent which has the potential to cause harm to vulnerable target. Hazards can be both natural or human induced. Sometimes natural hazards such as floods and drought can be caused by human activity. On the other hand, man-made hazards can include hazardous materials, fires, groundwater contamination, transportation accidents, structures failures, mining accidents, explosion, and also the act of terrorism. A disaster is any event that causes widespread human, economic, and environmental losses or impact that seriously disrupt normal functioning of a community. When an event causes significant number of dead or missing people in an area, it is considered a disaster. So this explains that for a disaster to take place, the normal operation of human community must be completely disrupted. We have many examples of natural disasters caused by earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, etc. The damage must be widespread enough to alter the normal operation of the community affected. So if the damage is widespread, it is called a disaster. If it is only an agent which has a potential to cause harm, it is called hazard. So that's the difference says between hazard and disaster. The damage must be widespread enough to alter normal operation in the community affected. In modern society, the event of a disaster sparks an international involvement and nearby countries or states aid in disaster recovery operation. Disasters are hazards that have become active, harming humanity in the process. For example, a volcano eruption is the perfect example of a hazard that becomes a disaster. Oil leaks can also be considered disasters as they affect the health of a marine life in the ocean and threaten important food sources. The level of severity of the disaster is determined based on the number of lives missing or lost and on the conditions of the survivors. An event is considered a disaster according to the assessed cost of repairing or rehabilitating the structures and public infrastructures that have been damaged or destroyed. An event is also considered a disaster based on the amount of income lost from work, livelihood, and other economic activities that have been stopped or slowed down due to disaster. For example, when an earthquake strikes in a particular area, the intensity of earthquake shaking determines the severity of damage, deaths, injured, missing, and so on. In turn, the main factors affecting earthquake shaking intensity are earthquake's deep proximity to the fault line, the underlying soil, and building characteristics. Remember that the event is also proportional to the level of severity. So therefore, if a particular place has a strong soil foundation and the buildings are built with the earthquake resisting support, the outcome of the event would be different. Also, as well ended to less damage of properties and deaths. Disasters usually follow hazards that are not anticipated. When disaster occurs, the community affected may lose its ability to cope with the loss and damage using its own resources. Hence, disaster may be prevented if proper and effective disaster plans are in place. Disaster risk may be specific to a location or condition of a community, usually if a certain hazards frequent a specific location or if the present situation of a community puts in a dangerous position. The disaster risk becomes a vital consideration in defining the safety of the people in the community. Disaster risk determines the tendency of a community to face disasters. For example, the disaster risk of storm surge for a community living 100 kilometers away from the seashore, compared with that of a community that is 10 kilometers near the shore. Another example of storm surge happened in the Philippines was on 8th of November 2013. The Typhoon Yolanda, international code named Typhoon Haiyan, made landfall in the central Philippine Islands region. The 600 kilometers diameter Typhoon Yolanda crossed the Philippine archipelago, bringing widespread devastation in its path. Storm surge were primarily responsible for the 6,190 dead, 1,786 missing, and 28,626 injured in Yolanda's aftermath. Tacloban residents were used to typhoons, but according to some interviews, they were reportedly caught by surprise by the deluge coming from the sea. Several concrete structures where residents usually take shelter and were completely washed out by the surge. Disaster risk determines the tendency of a community to face disasters. If appropriate preparedness and evacuation procedures are applied in a proper time, the community of prone areas in Tacloban may not be totally put in a dangerous situation. Disaster risk may also be reduced in a specific occasion as much as possible. For Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, once said, "We cannot eliminate disaster or the hazard, but we can mitigate the risk. There is no way to escape hazard because they are part of life. Every day and everywhere there is hazard. Hazards can be identified but difficult to avoid. Because hazards can be recognized, a community that is hazard prone may increase its disaster risk, especially if it is not equipped or prepared for possible disasters arising from hazard." For this quotation, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stressed out the relevance of disaster risk reduction to achieving sustainable development. When we reduce disaster risk, we increase our chances of achieving the Millennium Development Goals or MDGs and building truly sustainable world for all. We must always remember that disaster risk reduction aims to reduce the damage caused by natural hazards like earthquakes, typhoons, tsunami, etc. For mitigation of risk as taking steps to reduce adverse effects, that is so important to develop a strategy to be prepared and aware in times of disaster. Big idea. A hazard becomes a disaster only when the community is not prepared for it. This explains that a natural disaster can occur in any time. Some disasters give a warning, such as storms preceding a flood. Others, such as earthquakes, give a little or no warning. Once a disaster happens, the time to prepare is gone. The best way to cope with this natural disaster is to prepare by having a plan before it strikes. We have the types of disaster: natural and human caused disaster, also known as the man-made disaster. It affects thousands of people each year. Major adverse events such as this have the potential to cause catastrophic loss of life and physical destruction. They are often unexpected and can leave the whole communities in shock. So, upon this statement, catastrophic event means a natural disaster that can cause loss of life and physical destruction. Other examples are war or terrorism or any fire, flood or explosion, regardless of cause, that cause damage to property of significant severity and magnitude. Another example for this catastrophic event that leave whole communities in shock is in 2013 the Typhoon Yolanda, also known as the Typhoon Haiyan. We have the types of disaster. People who live through a disaster can express emotional distress, feelings of anxiety, constant worrying, trouble sleeping, and other depressions like symptoms are common responses to disaster before, during, and after the event. Many people are able to bounce back from disaster with help from family and the community, but others may need additional support to cope and move forward on the path of recovery. Anyone can be at risk, including survivors living in the impacted areas and first responders and recovery workers. For example, your community has been hit by a natural disaster. You're probably trying to make sense of what happened and deal with the stress of the situation. This event creates a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety for those directly and indirectly affected. In the days and weeks following the disaster, you may begin to have some of these common reactions. It is normal to have difficulty managing your feelings after major traumatic events. However, if you don't deal with the stress, it can be harmful for your mental and physical health. So, we have tips for coping with these difficult times. We talk about it, spend time with friends and family, take care of yourself, limit exposure to images of the disaster, find time for activities you enjoy, take one thing at a time, do something positive, avoid drugs and excessive drinking, ask for help when you needed it. The types of disaster are classified according to the hazard that caused them to happen. There are two main types of disaster: the natural and man-made. Natural disaster. Natural disasters are large-scale geological or meteorological events that have the potential to cause loss of life or property. This type of disasters include tornadoes and severe storms, hurricanes and tropical storms, floods, wildfires, earthquakes, and drought. Here are the pictures of a tornado and severe storms. So let us define what is a tornado. A tornado is a violent rotating column of air extending from a thunderstorm to the ground. The most violent tornadoes are capable of tremendous destruction with a wind speed of up to 300 miles per hour. They can destroy large buildings, trees, and vehicles and hundreds of yards. How tornado is being formed. Within the storm, a strong vertical wind shear causes a horizontal rotating cylinder, as you can see in the figure. The abrupt flips the rotating cylinder within the supercell. The rotating cylinder of air narrows, becomes stretched, and spins faster and faster, forming a tornado. Tornadoes are able to die off when they move over colder ground or when the cumulonimbus clouds above them start to break up. It is not completely understood as to how exactly tornadoes form, grow, and die. We have also the severe storms. It is a thunderstorms that produce 1-inch hail or larger in diameter and equal or exceed 58 miles an hour. The size of the watch can vary depending on the weather situation. They are usually issued for duration of 4 to 8 hours only. We have hurricanes and tropical storms. Hurricanes form over the warm ocean water of the tropical place. When warm moist air over the water rises, it is replaced by cooler air. The cooler air will then warm and start to rise. The cycle causes huge storm clouds to form. Hurricanes happen when the oceans have been warm during the summer months. In the North Atlantic, hurricane season is from June 1 to November 30, but most hurricanes happen during the fall. As hurricane winds spiral around and around storm, they push water into the ground at the storm center. Next, we have the tropical depression. We have the variety of tropical definition. We have the tropical depressions, tropical storm, and hurricane. A tropical storm is a hazard that brings heavy rainfall, strong winds, and other related hazards such as mudslides and floods. When the tropical storms reach a land, they begin to lose their energy and die out. This is because they are no longer receiving the heat, energy, and moisture from the ocean, which is needed to drive the storm. We have also the floods. A flood occurs when water inundates the land that normally dry, which can happen in a multitude of ways. Excessive rain, a ruptured dam or levee, rapid melting of snow or ice, or even an unfortunately placed dam can overwhelm a river, spreading over the adjacent land called a floodplain. Next, we have the wildfires. Sometimes fires occur naturally ignited by heat from the sun or a lightning strike. However, the majority of wildfires are the result of human carelessness. Causes include arson, campfires, discarding of cigarettes, not burning debris properly, or playing with matches or fireworks. Next, we have the earthquakes. Earthquakes are usually caused when rock underground suddenly breaks along a fault. If there is no fault, there is no earthquake. This sudden release of energy causes the seismic waves that make the ground shake. Now we have the two types of waves, the P waves and the S waves. When two blocks of rock or two plates are rubbing against each other, they stick a little. They don't just slide smoothly, the rocks catch on each other. We have also the drought. Drought happened when there is not enough rain for a long period of time. El Nino is an example of a drought. It's not like a dry spell. There is so little precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, or any kind of moisture that a whole region recovery programs. What is a severe storms and floods? Those are the most common types of natural disasters reported in US. So here in the Philippines, severe storms and floods also is the common types of natural disaster. These meteorological events are occasionally preceded by presidential emergency declaration, requiring state and local planning prior to the event, such as evacuation and protection of public assets. Disaster distress helpline staff are available to speak to those who call or text before, during, and after a natural disaster. Man-made disaster. A man-made disaster, also called technological disasters, are distractions from man-made hazards such as bomb explosion, chemical spills, and even war. Other examples include industrial accidents, shootings, acts of terrorism, and incidents of mass violence. As with natural disasters, these types of traumatic events may also cause loss of life and property. They may also prompt evacuation from certain areas and overwhelm behavioral health resources in the affected communities. This explains that a man-made disaster have an element of human intent, negligence or error involving a failure of a man-made system, as opposed to natural disaster resulting from natural hazards only, such as man-made disasters are crime, arson, civil disorder, terrorism, chemical threat, cyber attacks, etc. Effects of disaster. The effects of disaster vary mostly on severity of exposures of life, property, and the environment to the hazard. Usually, the severity of the effects of a disaster is higher in the community directly affected by the hazard, although the severity becomes lower in nearby communities of the affected community. The effects may still be felt and may be significant. According to measurable severity, the effects of disasters are primary, secondary, tertiary in nature. We have the primary effects. The primary effects are direct result of natural disaster, such as collapse of buildings and water damages. So, some of the main causes for building collapse are bad design, faulty construction, foundation failure, extraordinary loads, unexpected failure modes, or a combination causes. But collapse also occur due to natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, cyclones, and fires. In order to mitigate or to avoid or to prevent primary effects or collapse of buildings, no, we can also apply the earthquake resistant techniques or the earthquake resistant materials in our houses or even buildings. We have also secondary effects. What is this secondary effects? It is or are the result of primary effects. So, examples of secondary effect include power outages due to fallen trees or damaged building and fires from broken gas lines. In this example, the fallen trees and the damaged building would be the primary effects that cause the power outages and fires. Those are pertaining to the secondary effects. Tertiary effects are the long-term effects of natural disaster. These include changes in the landscape and natural features, loss of habitat and crop failure, or reduction due to cooler temperatures or other interference. For example, we have the Pansipit River of Taal volcano. This is a bright example of a tertiary effects. As you can see in the image, the before and after environment of the river. After the eruption, the river is the sole drainage outlet. The Pansipit River shares many of the unique biota found in the lake. Now the lake was totally damaged and there is a lot of fishes died in the river. We have the perspective on disaster. Most people would look at disasters in the same perspective. As humans, the first thing we notice in the aftermath of a disaster is its effect on fellow humans. However, to evaluate the overall results of a disaster experts examine them from different points of view. For this slide, no, the damage caused by disaster is immeasurable and influences the mental and socio-economic, political, and cultural state of the affected area. Human response to natural hazards are assumed to be rooted primarily in the way individuals think, behave, and interact in the environment. Disasters that are unexpected occur suddenly, causing widespread damage, and are understood to be traumatic and associated with a high degree of psychological disturbance. We have also the physical perspective. This physical perspective includes the visible or tangible materials, whether natural or man-made, which have been affected by a disaster. The altered or removed structures may change the landscape zoning and accessibility of an area. For example, cracks or fissures on main roads may require a detour or a new access road. Hence, changes in the frequency of movement of people and vehicle in the area may eventually affect zoning or the value and use of properties within the vicinity. Next, another example is cracks or fissures on main roads may require a detour or access new road. Hence, changes in the frequent of movement of people and vehicles in the area may eventually zoning or the value and use of the properties with the vicinity. So if there is a crack or fissures in the main road, there is a warning or to avoid the street that has a crack or fissures to prevent accidents for the motorists. We have also the psychological perspective. A psychological perspective refers to the people's emotional, cognitive, or interpersonal reactions to difficulties. Catastrophic events can cause shock, terror, anxiety, disbelief, nightmares, trauma, social withdrawal, or alienation or depression to victims. So, studies have shown that the Department of Social Welfare and Development partnered with volunteers from the two academic institutions to provide psychosocial first aid, or what we call this the VFA, to internally displaced persons affected by the eruption of the volcano, for example. With the surfacing of emotional distress, the psychological first aid team of DSWD recommended continuous counseling sessions, skills training, needs assessment for adult evacuees, and the conduct of different learning activities inside the camp for children evacuees. The DSWD welcomed this recommendation, which will help the evacuees cope with their present situation. For instances, a person who witnessed a loved one struggling for survival or dying in the process during a disaster may be traumatized. This traumatic event or situation can cause a long-term depression, can affect person's well-being. Any neglect of psychological support could impair efforts towards physical rehabilitation. This is why the DSWD becomes vital in post-disaster management. This government agency empowers the people and aims to improve their quality of life in the aftermath of the disaster. Next, we have the socio-cultural perspective. It centers on the responses of the people, whether the victims or not, to emergency situation and to kind of assistance they receive. The characteristic of affected families, such as their religions, customs, attitudes, beliefs, and values, can influence their approach to or their recovery from the disaster. So, Studies have shown that sociocultural parameters influences people responses to disaster, traditions, belief system and practices. For example, a group of people may believe that the disaster which struck their village is a punishment by Mother Nature or destroying the environment. This belief may delay or impede relief efforts because it can overpower the need to be quick in responding to instructions or a fast and organized system of assistance. Okay, so the behavior of individuals before, during, and after a disaster can greatly affect the impact and the recovery time. Along this line, international organizations and research scholarships have emphasized that having a better understanding of human behavior can improve effectiveness of disaster risk management. Another important aspect of this perspective is the degree of cooperation. Among the community members, the level of social support may made immediate risk as sufficient and available, and a community is united or has a shared vision of recovery. In the Philippines, bayanihan has always displayed whenever a disaster strikes a certain region in the country. The term bayanihan refers to the spirit of unity inherent in Filipinos to help each other, especially in time of crisis. Even Filipinos residing abroad show sympathy and support by participating in relief initiatives. We have also the economic perspective. The economic perspective focuses on the disruption of economic activities in the community. Disaster, whether small or large scale, brings about serious economic consequences. Disaster loss is usually assessed in terms of injuries and deaths. Destruction of fixed assets and infrastructures and disruptions in the flow of goods and services can obviously affect the economic factors such as gross domestic product, growth rates, indebtedness levels, and fiscal deficits. The best example for this was on 15th of October 2013, a powerful earthquake measuring 7.2 on the Richter scale shook the Philippines. The epicenter was located in the island province of Bohol in central Visayas, but was felt as far as southern Mindanao. Less than a month, Typhoon Yolanda swept the central Visayas, although it did not cause significant damage on the island of Bohol. It has a strong impact on the emergency responses. Many government and international humanitarian resources were moved from Bohol to address the health needs caused by Haiyan, which in turn delayed the speed of recovery in Bohol. The earthquake affected over 1.2 million people. 222 people died, 195 in Bohol. 976 were injured and 8 people missing. According to Bohol Governor Edgar Chato, the damage caused by earthquake in the island province has been estimated to reach 2.5 billion or approximately $58 million. In addition to this is the demand for a considerable humanitarian assistance from various sectors. Media plays an important role in the context. Through the media, a large number of communities may be offered to participate in relief endeavors. According to our previous example about Bohol's natural disaster that hits by earthquake, the same local responses were evident in the aftermath of the earthquake and typhoon. After the earthquake, several organizations and individuals responded to the call for help, including Bohol Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the BCCI, in close partnership with the provincial government and other civil society organizations. Several informal online coalitions were established, including the Hope for Bohol and Padayon Continue Bohol. These social media networks became virtual message boards and sources for mobilization efforts. They also serve as storyboards for acts of heroism, kindness, and hope. Initially, pictures were posted and depicting the devastation wrought by the earthquake. One could almost hear the collective gasp pictures posted online of the severe damage of centuries-old churches, which serves as a tourist attraction in important places of worship to Boholanos. Eventually, pictures showing hope and survival became the norm. Next, we have the political perspective. Deals with how government services are used to reduce loss or damage by preparing for and preventing disasters. This perspective is critical because, in some cases, there exist inequities in societies that create political prejudice in developing plans and policies related to disaster risk reduction and recovery plans. Best, this is why it is important for governments to always consider poverty reduction strategies in their platform. Budget constraint is another important issue. Some governments tend to spend less on prevention and reduction, only to realize that post disaster programs become more costly because of miscalculation or negligence. So, best example for this is the political issue happened in Tacloban, Yolanda Rescue Operation. Laban Mayor Alfred Romualdez said that the national government refused to help his city unless he signed an ordinance to allow this. Romualdez said he initially asked for more foot soldiers, among others to help rescue, for Tacloban residents days after Yolanda. I was never given that, he said in congressional hearing of Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act of 2010. Then around a week after he made the request, he said Rojas called him and other city officials to a meeting. He said Rojas told me in that meeting we have to legalize everything here. I asked what is to legalize here. He said that it is a gray area, that the national government is coming in and doing all this, the mayor recalled. He supposedly replied to Rojas, why is it illegal? As far as I know, the president is the president of the Philippines, and he's also president of Tacloban City. Nothing in the laws says the national government needs an ordinance to help Tacloban, Romualdez said. He answered me and told me, you have to remember, we have to be careful. You are a Romualdez and the president is an Aquino. So for this example, the political perspective for Tacloban Yolanda Rescue Operation placed a negative impact on how government services was imposed or applied. Therefore, the outcome of disaster depends on how political perspective were properly implemented. So in this case of Tacloban, the political perspective was critical ending to corruption in terms of reducing damage by preparing for and preventing disaster. Next, we have the biological perspective. Biological perspective takes into consideration the potential or infectious or communicable diseases after a disaster takes place. In the aftermath of a disaster, humans and animals that have been injured become susceptible to infections. Okay, so this study, as you can see in our image, provides a detailed analysis of the conditions seen in health facilities in the aftermath of Typhoon Yolanda. It illustrates that communicable diseases were the most common syndrome group, and that acute respiratory infection was the most common of the 21 syndromes. So the entry of virulent organism in an unbalanced ecosystem becomes easier in a crowded area, especially in evacuation and distribution centers, where virus transmission happens through dispersal. direct contact, and biological agents such as rodents, where medical services, sanitation facilities, and recovery programs are scarce or inadequate, deaths and losses may be inevitable. Ultimately, in contagions is not controlled. The productivity of the population is affected, which will then affect other aspects of the society. Okay, so syndromes which work inconsistent in their consultation rates throughout the whole period, such as meningitis, suspected measles, acute hemorrhagic fever, tetanus, leptospirosis. So these syndromes showed rates of less than zero point 0.1 for the whole 150-day post-disaster period, indicating nevertheless a potential risk this syndrome poses during response and recovery periods. Risk factors underlying disaster. While there is a very little or nothing can be done to prevent natural hazards, some human actions worsen the risk of their occurrence, making the probable disasters more difficult to prevent or even anticipated. Most of the anthropogenic or man-made activities as part of human exploration and advancement compound the risk of disasters. Here are some of them: housing and building development. In the pursuit of addressing the modern-day needs and wants of people, the environment is put at risk. So this explains that the government budgets for housing and building projects were not monitored properly. This results to greater risk and danger for the near future. Rehabilitations, recovery, and reconstruction programs in the Philippines are hindered by recurrent disasters, a lack of financial resources, and politicization of the process, linking immediate relief with longer-term recovery. And disaster risk reduction remains one of the most persistent challenges of the aid sector globally, largely because of continued underfunding of recovery programs. Next is the presence of physical prone to disaster risk. The presence of physical structures prone to disaster risk. Some disasters take place without anyone knowing them because the site of disasters are void of any structure or community. So this explains that the level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poor are usually more vulnerable to disaster because they lack the resources to build sturdy structures, put other engineering measures in place to protect themselves from being negatively impacted by disaster. We have also the institutional framework and system for risk reduction prevention. Some disasters may not be predicted. They may only be recognized when they happen. The standard on building codes, infrastructure planning, and financing emergency policies and other protocols change drastically based on experiences from a serious disaster. The best example for this is the country Japan. Japan, for example, reviews its building code each time there is a major disaster affecting the country. In 1981, Japan adopted its first set of building codes that focus on earthquake resilience. In 2000, Japan updated its codes based on lessons learned from the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Kobe earthquake includes features that add resilience to high-rise structures such as extra steel bracing, giant rubber pads, and embedded hydraulic shock absorbers in the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. And tsunami started debates on inclusion of larger and more extensive designs of buildings along the coast. So here are some of the design of the high-rise structures in Japan. It has the extra steel bracing, the giant rubber pads, and embedded hydraulic shock absorbers as you recognize at the right side image. Okay, so at the end of this discussion, you are able to answer the activity number 1 in your module. And I will give some supplementary activity in your Google Classroom. Thank you for viewing. God bless.